You're listening to the Back Home Network, presented by Home Field Apparel.
Welcome back to Crimson Cast. Galen Clavio joining you. It is the 16th of April, Tuesday. We are on the short side of April now as we head into among the busiest times on the sports calendar. NFL draft coming up. We got the NBA playoffs about to start, NHL playoffs about to start, Kentucky Derby's around the corner, Indy 500's around the corner, all kinds of things happening. And we are going to chat about one of those big things with today's guest, Courtney Cronin of ESPN and an Indiana Hoosier, joining us here on the show. Not the first time that Courtney's been on Crimson Cast, but it's been too long. It's good to see you. How you doing?
My first appearance on Crimson Cast, now that I'm like racking my brain on this, was the night that Bill Lynch was fired, that Sunday night in 2010.
That's right.
I remember that was my first time I ever went on, and I don't even know where that episode is today, if it even exists.
It was lost to the Egyptian hackers, which we've told this story many times, but for those who haven't heard it, back in the old days when you had to run a podcast through a WordPress account, you had to install this like special software that's called PodPress, and that was how you published things. Unfortunately, WordPress back then, unless you updated it every day, which if you know me, you know I'm not hitting the update button every day, was susceptible to security flaws. And so on two different occasions, we lost our entire library of podcasts because these Egyptian hackers would get into your WordPress account and they'd like throw like Egyptian flags up everywhere.
I totally remember this.
So there's a few podcasts that have survived from that era. And I got to say, both of us were not as good as we are now at being on air. So I'm kind of glad that nobody can go back and listen. If you really want to hear Courtney and me, there's stuff lurking on YouTube, and I won't tell you where it is, but that stuff is out there from a couple of years after that. So
yeah, we looked very different. I'm putting it nicely. We looked very different. I had bleach blonde hair because for some reason I thought that was a good decision when I was a junior in college. We live and we learn. And I agree. We have come a very long way since then. But the roots of that and the Egyptian hackers, God, I can remember that. Was IU Sportcom one of those sites that was affected by that?
Yeah, that was when we made the ill-fated decision to try to switch to Drupal as our programming setup, our CMS setup for a little bit. We're getting way in the programming weeds for the folks out there, exactly what they were tuning in for. But no, yeah, that was IU Sportcom got hit by that. It was a weird time on the internet in a variety of ways, and I'm just glad that that's largely behind us at this point. So we're going to have Courtney talk about her background. For those of you who don't know, Courtney went to IU, got her start in sports journalism, at least at the college level at IU, and has gone on to tremendous things career-wise. So we're going to talk with her about her getting started, what she's doing right now, and I've got some questions that a couple of our sports media alums wanted me to ask just in general. So we'll throw those in. So all that coming up in a second, but first, just a couple of quick notes. We are brought to you by Home Field Apparel here on the Back Home Network, your place to go for the finest in college fashions, the softest fabrics, the coolest designs. We are at a point right now where, we don't want, Home Field knows. It's like college season ends. It's like, well, the people's interest can wane. So for the Bloomington crowd, which is always the biggest selling crowd for Home Field, at least I like to say that it is, they are dropping this Thursday an extensive Little 500 collection. I think it's like 8 different pieces of apparel. I believe there's a Little 5 bomber jacket involved. There's some ringer tees. If you're an IU person at all, and I'm assuming if you're watching or listening to this podcast that you are, you need to get yourself over to Home Field. They're actually going to have a pop-up store in Bloomington. And this is a great opportunity, not just to get Little 5 gear, but if you go to the pop-up store at Upland on the 19th or the 20th, you get 20% off your order. And that's important, folks, because Home Field, they like to target your bank account with surgical precision. Every time you think that it's safe, Home Field's dropping in with some stuff and you're like, damn, I got to buy that. And so this is a chance to buy a little bit more for the same amount of money. So head on over to Upland, 19th and the 20th. That's at the end of this week if you're in Bloomington, or just hop on homefieldapparel.com and get yourself some of that little 500 swag here at Home Field Apparel, your place to go for the finest in college fashions. Also, just a reminder, folks, who are on Crimson Cast, we are on Substack now. Join the community. It's free. You get emails delivered right to your inbox that have what podcasts we've done. You don't have to search through Twitter or hope that your Facebook account is still working. You can just get in your email, click on the link. We've got video podcasts going up pretty regularly on Spotify right now. We've got regular podcasts on Apple. So go ahead and subscribe if you want to kick a little bit of scratch towards the podcast to help support it financially. We've got that option as well. We try to throw some extra stuff in. I'm sorry, I have not recorded a VIP video in a while. I've been away. I was in Vegas for a few days at the National Association of Broadcasters conference. So I'm both jet lagged and behind on my VIP content. I promise I will rectify at least one of those things before I wake up tomorrow morning. Probably not the video, but we'll see. Anyway, so again, crimsoncast.substack.com. We'd love to have you as part of the community. Almost 900 people now subscribing to Crimson Cast on Substack, which is really nice. So anyway, Courtney, let's talk about you. So for those who don't know the Courtney Cronin origin story, where are you from, and what brought you to campus in the first place?
So I'm from Glenview, Illinois. For all of the North Shore people that transcend down to Indiana every year, I had 26 from my high school, Glenbrook South, that went to IU. And I always tell the story of how my mom and I were on opposite sides of where we thought I should go to school. So Indiana was the first college I had ever visited back in 2005. I went during the fall time, at some point, in October. It's just they set me up to fail, more or less, because I was never going to like another school once I went to Indiana in the fall. My mom wanted me to go to DePaul. My grandfather was an alumni at DePaul. He started a scholarship foundation. He came from nothing. The school holds a lot of meaning to my family. But I had gone on a visit at DePaul, and I knew the school was about 1,200 in terms of the overall enrollment. It just felt really small to me. And when I knew people who had gone to Indiana University before, the sell was, if you want to do broadcast, if you want to do journalism, you don't have to wait till your junior year, like Syracuse, like Northwestern, like Missouri, like all these other storied programs. And at the time, what I always tell my students at Indiana whenever I come and do a boot camp is, you don't know how spoiled you are, because none of this existed before Dr. Clavio took over the program. And of course, moving the journalism school and moving all of the entities involved into the media school in 2014. And then on top of that, just the ability to have so many different routes to get on air far sooner than your junior year. But that started long time ago at Indiana. And that's what sold me. I wanted to go, I wanted to work, and that's all I did. I didn't have a sorority. I didn't have many outside activities other than student media. That's where I put all my effort into when, as a student, freshman year, all the way till the time I graduated in May of 2012. And I loved every minute of it. There were a lot of ups and downs with it. And I look back at the work now and I cringe, because I'm like, man, the students today must just be that much better than we were coming out. But it's really cool for me to see how many alumni there are from my grade, my class, and around that time that have made it in this industry and made Indiana into a destination school for anyone wanting to go in any form of sports journalism. And it's cool all these years later that I get giddy and goosebumps when I talk about it, because it truly does mean that much to me.
It is why the reason I was in Las Vegas at NIB, I was doing a panel about engaging sports media alumni in your program, which I'm like, well, gosh, I just rattle off the names, and I'm like, well, here's what we do with all of them. But it is fascinating the amount of talent that was there right when you were there, right when a lot of the kind of the modern program here at IU was getting started. And it's names that people know. I mean, we had Trisha on last month. We've had you on before. But it's also people like, Greg Murray was there when you were there, who, of course, for those of you who were paying attention, he was IU's baseball and women's basketball broadcaster for quite a while. Scott Agnes, who's still covering things up in Indianapolis, was there at that point. And, Sam Daywig, who's working for Meadowlark Media. And there's this whole list of people, Cody Sherritt, who's working for the U.S. men's and women's national teams. And it's wild to me that all of those people were there at the exact same time. Yep. I look back on it, and it's we have great clusters of students now, and we've had great clusters of alumni before, but for that many people without really a program that specifically was like devoted to that, that's really special. And I've always considered myself lucky that I was there when all of you folks were there, because it was a two-way street. I mean, I needed people that would be willing to work on this stuff, and you all did an amazing job.
That was a really unique time. Outside of you, there was no other like faculty guidance. We technically at IUS TV had some sort of faculty advisor. I couldn't tell you who that person was. I really have no clue. I know that we got something within the funding that they had worked out where we got 25 cents for every student who enrolled. And at that time, the enrollment was like 40 grand. So that was our budget. But that group that you speak of, and you can add in a couple other names, Logan Robertson, Tony Adranya, Lucas Mayer, AJ Shub. Like,
this is the problem with naming.
I know. It's like
out, and I'm like, I'm sorry. Well, yeah. Sorry.
No, but like I say all that to say, like, that was my little network, and we all had to stay close in order to make what we wanted out of the program, because if we didn't do it, nobody would. And that's like, I see what it is now in seeing that there's IUS TV, there's the Hoosier Network, there's all of these things that didn't exist, or they existed in a different fashion, but like the expansion of it to where there's multiple competing networks just on the broadcast side. Like that's what we wanted from this program. We wanted to have options outside of just like one thing. And that's what I think so many of us did well. And, Trisha and I go back to our sophomore year when we first met. Cody and I, the same thing. And some of my like closest friends in this industry are people that I met early on in my days at Indiana, like trying to do this for real when we were, kind of all starting out, everybody going to the call out for IUS TV. And it's wild. However many years ago that was, I'm not counting or anything, but to go back and look at that and say, wow, we really made something out of nothing. And to see how far like the program has come is such a reflection on the amount of effort that people put in to make it as good as it is now.
Yeah. It's gratifying because so many of you are out doing like covering things and are becoming or are already household names in terms of where people are going to get their information and news on things. And, but it doesn't happen overnight, and it's not just the college experience. It's the route that you take after you get out of college. And you had a really interesting one. I mean, I a lot of times I'll talk with like high school seniors and they'll, like, who do you want to be? And they always rattle off kind of the same types of names. And it's always for me like, well, let's talk about what a similar person, like what somebody in our program has done to try to get to that point, and how it's not really a straight line. And your whole trajectory was really fascinating in that you didn't start out in a journalism role per se. So like talk a little bit about like just kind of peg off like where you went and what you were doing.
Sure. So my first like coming out of college, it was a post-grad internship, but we were there every single day. It was a job. My first job was at the NCAA in a post-grad capacity. And I got to back up to March of 2012, because up until that point, second semester senior year, I came back to school and I was full steam ahead. I'm going to get a job in local TV. I'm going to go about this however I have to. I'll print off 1 million copies of my resume, package it together with a literal DVD. I remember going to Mr. Copy and packaging these things, spending tons of money that I, these things probably didn't even make it to the desk of the people I was sending it to. I don't even know where the hell these things are.
I think of the number of CDRs I burned.
Oh my God.
I funded some middle manager at UPS into retirement.
Same with the amount of reels I was sending out, and I heard nothing from anybody. Like I had interned at Fox 59 in Indianapolis, and Jeremiah Johnson, who's now he's now with the Pacers. He's been there, I think, over a decade. Remember, there was an opening probably like January or February, so I wasn't ready for it yet, but there was an opening in 2012 for a weekend sports anchor in Fort Wayne. And I remember it might have been the station he came from, and he wrote me this just the most gracious letter of recommendation. And I was like, this is awesome. Like I will at least hear something. Never heard a word from the people that I sent that thing off to, or if it even got to the desk of whoever, hiring manager, news director, whatever. And so that kind of became my song and dance for a couple of months. And my friend Casey Richards at the time was a year older than me. He's a product of IU, of Indiana University, but he was in sport communication through Hyper. I know you had a bunch of classes where he was in your classes, and we became very close friends. It's funny, I'm going to a Cubs game with him, my brother, and Cody Sherritt on Sunday, which is just like all these years later, just like how close our little group still is. But Casey was at the NCAA and working in digital communications in an internship capacity. I had heard about the internship through him. And as I'm applying for all these TV jobs and not hearing anything, I'm like, well, I better have a safety net. Yeah. So I applied for the NCAA job and I ended up getting it. It was in digital communications, which again, is kind of like journalism adjacent. And I figured I'll take this opportunity. I'll move to Indianapolis, cool city. I've always wanted to live there anyways. And we'll see where it goes. And it was the best decision I could have made because it taught me a side of what I ended up doing for my first legitimate journalism job that I wouldn't have had I not taken that post-grad internship experience, which was the video production element. So I was in Indy for 10 months, and it was a wild time in college athletics. Like, if you think the NIL era is like the Wild West in 2000, like everything post 2021, it is, but let's go back to 2012 when they were talking about putting the death penalty on Penn State for the Jerry Sandusky awful scandal that surrounded that program. Then the stuff that was happening with Nevin Shapiro down at Miami. It was a weird time, a very weird time to be there. And it was cool for me to get to see the underbelly of college athletics and how it was handled from the national office and really how it was not handled. But no, I very much appreciated my time at the NCAA because it set me up for my opportunity to get into journalism by picking up all my stuff and moving down to Jackson, Mississippi to work at the state paper of record, which was the Clarion Ledger. And they hired me to build their sports video platform, which I had done all the on-camera stuff. I had shot all my stuff. I had edited when I was in college, but I really didn't know about how to structure all of that into more or less a library and a network. And how do you make these things look good? How do you make, what are the X's and O's of audio, of lighting, of the production element that I just wasn't sure of because I wasn't doing any of that. It wasn't required of me to do that in college.
Right.
So I got to learn that at the NCAA and then took those skills with me to my first job. And from there, it was a blank slate, a completely, nothing, this position did not exist before I got down there. So I had a chance at a very young age to build something and be proud of it at like 22 years old. And everyone asked me like, oh, so you're a writer because, my main job, which I know we'll get into, my main job at ESPN and for ESPN.com is covering the Chicago Bears. That's multifaceted, but writing is a huge part of that. I didn't have writing skills coming out of college. I learned that when I was at the Clarion Ledger, when I was a quote unquote professional journalist at like 23 at this time, when I had kind of transitioned roles into more of a writing role when I was covering preps and recruiting. But that's always like, I always tell students, you better leave Indiana having taken a couple writing classes through the media school. Otherwise I would be very upset.
And it's important to keep in mind, like the whole idea of converged media training didn't exist yet in 2011, 2012. Correct. I mean, it was, and this was when I went to school. I've talked about this. Like I got a little writing experience. I worked at the IDS for a couple of semesters, but I was studying to be a broadcaster. And back then, like that was a legitimate, like that was a fork in the road. You went one direction or another. It's why like when ESPN started putting print reporters on television, it was a big deal because it's like, well, wait, these people aren't supposed to be there and the broadcasters aren't supposed to be writing. And so the idea that they would all do the same thing, it's just, we're so used to it now, but it really didn't exist that much 15 years ago.
No, it didn't. And watching how all of the different schools that are within the journalism realm, whether it was in telecom, whether it was in print journalism, whether it was in hyper with sport communication, watching them all converge under one roof, we were just late on that. So we had to kind of figure it out on our own. And fortunately for me, I was able to figure that out as a young journalist in the field where I had gotten myself in with my video skills and my broadcast skills and the ability to do something that nobody else at that paper had the capability of doing. And then when I was around all these writers and, I'm tagging along to all these different, these football games, these, recruiting like the signings and announcing, guys announcing where they're going, college football games, college baseball. That was actually a huge part of what I did initially when Mississippi State went out to the College World Series. We were churning out like 40 videos from like short interview videos all the way out to like full on features within a 3-week stretch. Like I was like, all right, well, I'm pretty good at this. I enjoy doing it. How about I learn the other side? How about I learn how to write? And so I was fortunate enough to do that. I was there for 3 years. So May of 2013 till right after signing day 2016. And at this time, I was very much in a predominant writing role. I was the high school sports and recruiting editor. I managed my own section for the newspaper, which at a newspaper of that size, which still was, we had 500,000 people in the entire Jackson metro area. I was still like the only full-time high school writer, and writing and producing my section and like working with my insane network of freelancers, which, you got to learn how to be able to manage people from a young age. And that gave me that skill. So I went out to California. It's a long story of how I got out there, but like the San Jose Mercury News hired me to do what I had initially done for the Clarion Ledger when I first got there, which was to build their sports video platform. They weren't a Gannett paper the way that the Clarion Ledger was. Gannett really went all in on video about 2015 on, but they had the same priorities, but it was doing it in a market that was number 6 in the country, and pro sports versus the colleges and high schools where I had unlimited access, more or less, to covering the Warriors, covering the Raiders, the 49ers, Major League Baseball, and just being in a completely different realm that I wasn't used to. So my first year out there was probably the hardest year I've had in my career. The transition from a personal and professional standpoint, living in a place that was 4 hours away from home, covering pro sports, my first crack at covering the NBA when the team is in the middle of a championship run for multiple years of me being out there.
Durant had just arrived at that point, right?
He got there the year. So like I got there in the midst of 73-9. So that season that they finished that regular season in 2016, longest stretch of the playoffs from Houston in the first round to Portland to who did they play in the Western Conference? To Oklahoma City. God, I like know more about Oklahoma City for my one stretch of like, which felt like 4 months out there, but we were there like a week and a half for the Western Conference Finals because it went 7, and then to Cleveland, which was when they built the joke about no 3-1 lead is safe because of the Warriors that year. They built a 3-1 lead. They ended up losing it. The Cavs came back. They won in 7. And then the following year, or a month later, not even, was when Kevin Durant joined in free agency. So I had a chance to cover some really cool things, which it's always wild when I'm on radio and people will bring up the Warrior stuff because I have to like really go far back. I'm like, God, I did that. Like that was a really long time ago, 2016, 17, because I was only out in the Bay Area for 17 months before I was going to go with several of my colleagues from the Mercury News to the Athletic. We saw kind of the writing on the wall with the structure of the newspaper and the ownership of, it was I believe a hedge fund that owned a bunch of these papers. And it was time to get out.
Well, anytime there's any hedge fund and media, tremendous comment.
Yeah, they're really well-run entities and they care about the people. But we saw the writing on the wall and we were all going to the Athletic, and literally as I'm finishing up a shoot, I had my contract signed, I paid a lawyer to look over it. And I was in Sunnyvale, California, working on a video shoot about Prague Marity, who is the number 2 in the front office. He's the cap guy for the San Francisco 49ers. Long story, his family owned a pizza place, and tragically and ironically, he lost his sister to an eating disorder. So it was kind of this dichotomy of a place that, had so many happy times for him and his family growing up, but then losing a sister to something that effectively they were doing every day, which was selling food, selling pizza, selling, food to people. So it was a really like heavy shoot. And I remember like putting a light away, like waiting for it to kind of cool down and closing the folds. And I looked down at my phone. I saw I had an email, and this was like on the heels of training camp starting that year. It was an email from my former deputy editor at ESPN who said, "Don't know what you're doing right now. no camp's right around the corner, but we have an opening for a Minnesota Vikings reporter. Would love for you to come out and at least like talk about it. So whirlwind week. I get hired at ESPN on my 27th birthday, which was really cool to like wake up in the morning after flying back from the car wash out there, which is what that's called, which is, it truly is. Like you just go through bang, 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 all these people, you consume a lot of information. They consume a lot of you. And I woke up to a call that I was hired, and I'm like, oh my God, the training camp's like just starting. And by the time I get there, it's going to be the season. And it was. And it was one of those moments that you just can't say no to when an opportunity like that came around. So I was in Minnesota for 5 years, started out like very truly and heavily at a different era than what we're doing, than what we have right now. Like there were so many more sports centers during the day. Our capabilities for .com, we were writing so much more. And I feel like the quality now is upped because we've pared a lot of those things down. But I was on like the season that I got there, the Vikings went to the NFC Championship kind of miraculously, for lack of a better term, not to play on the Minneapolis Miracle. But, you know, the second I get there, I didn't have true professional on-air live TV experience because the stuff I was doing in Mississippi was all live to tape for the most part. We had a couple live streams here and there, but I got to learn how to do that on the fly too. And it was awesome. And I spent 5 seasons doing that before moving to Chicago in March of 2022. My colleague, Jeff Dickerson, who was a mentor of mine, passed away from cancer. And they asked me to move back down here, which is home, of course. So kind of coming full circle with everything. And it's been the best decision I've ever made from a professional and a personal standpoint. And the opportunities I've had since I've been here, like my job title if you go on LinkedIn, if you go on anything, it'll say like Chicago Bears reporter for ESPN, but that's only a fraction of what I do. I have a show, my own show on Sunday morning on ESPN radio. I am constantly filling in on other shows on ESPN radio nationally. I have a presence here locally on ESPN 1000. Around the Horn, which has been on the network now for 22 years, is a huge part of my week every week. I've been doing it since I got back. I'm on twice a week, and it's been really neat to get to do a lot of different things and get to, flex muscles that aren't just my NFL world, even though right now it's April 16th. I'm up to here in NFL draft coverage right now, and Caleb Williams and everything that is about to impact the Bears as early as next Thursday.
And they just announced that you're going to be part of the wraparound coverage for the NFL draft. So when that sort of thing gets announced, obviously, it's happening ahead of time, but like what is expected of you for the NFL draft? Like what are they saying? Courtney, we have to have you doing X, Y, and Z during this coverage.
So I actually was talking with my producer about this today. Like it's an all hands on deck sort of effort. And there's 5 of us, I want to say, that are at teams. Like the common thread here is teams that are choosing quarterbacks and teams that have, multiple draft picks, like the Vikings, like the Chicago Bears, who are drafting at 1 and 9. So a lot of it is strategizing. How do we get on TV? Because there's going to be a lot of content, and the Sports Center shows have to figure out what are the biggest storylines. Of course, with Caleb Williams coming to the Bears, more than likely, unless like barring something insane happening, which I don't think is going to happen, but you never know. It's really like, it's going to be very heavy about the quarterback next week. So my producer, Melinda Adams, and I were having a talk today, just trying to figure out, all right, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday next week, Tuesday's the pre-draft press conference where we'll talk to Ryan Poles, the general manager. So it's gathering information from that. Wednesday, it's going to be from like 12 to 6, more or less, just like whatever Sports Center or NFL Live shows want you. Like you'll do a hit from there. The storylines will probably change. You're going to want to alter everything like from show to show, so it's not the same information, just at a different time.
Right.
And then Thursday's the draft, and that's going to be a busy day because we go from I think 11 a.m. all the way through the evening, and I typically don't leave there on night 1 until midnight. And you're back at it the next day when they bring in not 1, but 2 first-round draft picks. And it's going to be a really exciting time. And it's my first year getting to do the draft coverage for TV, in addition to all of the draft coverage I'll be providing over at ESPN.com. And that's a really cool opportunity that I'm very excited about, because typically they send out national reporters who don't have who are not team specific. But clearly I did something right to where they're like, you can just handle the Bears. But it's been a crazy offseason, but a very rewarding and good for business offseason for me, just given how in the news my team has been and how eager this fan base is and like the people who are consuming the Bears are to see, can this team get it right with the quarterback for once?
So this is, we have a lot of Bears fans and Chicago area natives in the podcast audience. And, this is an interesting role for you to be in because, you have to be a journalist. You're objective in the way you cover the team. But there's also, it feels like from an outsider's perspective, a requirement. You have to not just understand the team inside and out from a credibility perspective, but you have to understand the culture of Chicago sports and Bears fans in particular.
Yeah.
Which obviously you've grown up with and in and around. So, like, how do you put that into practice? Is it something that you're doing consciously, or do you not even have to think about it, given that you are so kind of familiar and ingrained in that culture to begin with?
Being from here, because, I've been here 2 years, and I feel like I've gained a lot of traction here in 2 years, not just because of the work that you put in, not just because of, the stories you break. All of those things are super important, and the quality of your work, first and foremost, stands for itself. But I'm from here. I know what this is like because I grew up in it. And a prime example of that is, well, people always ask me, like, oh, this is so cool. You must have, how cool it is to cover the hometown team and a team you were a fan of. And I will tell them honestly, my first Bears game that I ever went to as a quote unquote spectator, was the NFC Championship in 2010 when it was an interdivision. It was Packers, Bears. It was Jay Cutler got hurt in that game and they lost. It was a chance for them to go back to the Super Bowl and they lost, and the Packers ended up winning the Super Bowl that year. We didn't go to games when I was a kid because they were not a great team. They had won the Super Bowl 5 years before I was born. And if you just take a look at the names at the quarterback position from like Jim McMahon onwards, like Cade McNown was the quarterback that I grew up with as somebody who was a conscious, like, sponge of just taking in sports at that time, figuring out, what do I like? Do I like the Bulls? Do I like the Bears? Do I like the Cubs? Like, Bulls at my, like, when I was starting to really like come into being a sports fan, Bulls weren't very good anymore. Like, the Jordan years were when I was
Tim Floyd era, right?
Yeah, like the Jalen Rose era of the Bulls. Cool. Like, that's not, there wasn't much to get behind. Like the Cubs obviously like were my team because I remember 98 really well, like in the home run race that year and everything else. But like the Bears were just not a good football team. So my parents were like, we're a college football family. We'll go to Northwestern games. Not that that was much better, but like there were familial ties there. And I just kind of tagged along. But I can use that experience of knowing, oh yeah, like this is how tough it was for Bears fans, even though I wasn't a Bears fan because I wasn't really allowed to be, because like my parents were like, we're not paying for tickets to go watch this product. And I can understand the ones now who are so like worried, excited and worried. There's like this anxiety about, okay, finally everything's falling into place. I hope they get it right. And you can understand where they're coming from because there've been years before where it looked like it was going in the right direction, but there was something missing. Like in 2018, for example, the year that they had this otherworldly defense that was in a way spoiled by the quarterback play and obviously spoiled by a double doink. But like there was always something holding this team back. Now you can see all the pieces are in place, from a trade of the number one pick last year to then get the number one pick this year, which was a lot of luck involved in making that happen, but some strategic play by the team to find Carolina as a trade partner. And then on top of that, you've got a team that went on an upward trajectory at the end of last season after a really bad start. You've got a visionary in Kevin Warren who sees a big picture here for what this team can be and moving the team out of Soldier Field, but not that far away from it, and trying to build a stadium in the city. There's a lot of momentum around this team. And it's an exciting time to cover not only the Bears, but I thought about this last night. Like, Caleb Williams is going to hear his name called to Chicago next Thursday. Connor Bedard's going to win Rookie of the Year in the NHL, just got here in May of last year. Angel Reese and Camila Cardozo are going to come take the Sky back to where they were before their coach quit and decided to be a bench coach in Toronto for the Raptors with a better job than being the GM and the head coach of the Sky. And after winning a championship and how far that team has fallen, like, it's a really cool time to be in the Chicago sports media landscape because of this youth movement that is on the cusp of doing some really cool things, which that's something too. Like, I can't remember a time growing up where I had that as a sports fan, as somebody who wasn't covering teams, but was more consuming them. And being able to put all those pieces together, I think, and like being able to kind of have the institutional knowledge of this city really helps versus when I went into Minnesota, I didn't know anything about the Vikings. I mean, I grew up in the NFC North, but I had to learn. I still have my books right over there. I bought like 10 books from that time I got the job at ESPN to the time I moved out of Oakland. Like, I was like, all right, Fran Tarkington, let's go. Let's learn about those 4 Super Bowls the team went to and, lost all of them. Like, it's much different when you grew up in it, even if you were just kind of like through osmosis, learning about a team that now I know very well.
I think it's easy to underestimate how much knowledge you have to have, not using most of it, but never knowing when you're going to need to use the knowledge that you've got. And especially with as much content as you do. I mean, because it's not just the television hits. It's not just the stuff that you're writing for the web. The radio, sports talk radio in big markets, and really, I think it's just New York and Chicago. I think LA is a different animal largely, but New York and Chicago, that is a savage environment to have to operate in on a day-by-day basis. So, to be able to not just have the knowledge and selectively utilize it and put it out there, but also to understand how to deliver things. I mean, we've seen people in the Chicago radio market not fare particularly well because they are kind of sussed out as either not knowing what they're talking about or coming at things from an angle that doesn't actually make a lot of sense. And it's interesting when someone does get it. Like, you're going to have an audience. It's like, okay, we want to listen to this person over that person. But that's a hard thing to get your head wrapped around, and like how to do that on a day-by-day basis.
It is. And you're right about Chicago and New York being, and I'd throw Philly in there too.
Maybe Boston as well. But
Boston, like, I mean, there's really like 4 that are like true savagery style within like the way that content is delivered and the way that content is consumed, and the callers make everything. Like, I know we've moved into a completely different era of audio where it's not just sports talk radio and where podcasts rule a lot of people's, like, look at us right now. Like, this is content that people choose to like, versus when you get in the car and you turn on the radio, like, you're at the beck and call of what's on right now. Whereas in the podcast world, which has changed the way that we consume audio things on an audio platform, in Chicago still radio is king here. I mean, between myself at ESPN 1000, which I do a ton of stuff with them. I'm on the Chicago Bears podcast twice a week. I have multiple hits throughout the week, whether it's on Cap and J Hood, Carmen and Yurko, Waddle and Sylvie. I'm actually filling in for Cap on Friday. So it's me and Jonathan Hood, which is one of my favorite stories. That, like, I grew up listening to him when he was doing overnights on the Score. My brother and I'd be like, a White Sox or Cubs game gets over and we'd listen to Hoodie for like hours and hours, like in the summertime with like literally the old boom box that was in my room. And it's neat now that I get to like be in the, in the co-pilot seat with him, getting to do shows. I adore him and I adore everybody that works there, because the style, like to make it in this market, you better have your chops. Like, you better have opinions. You better have facts to back up your opinions, and you have to be bold about it. Like, you don't have to be obnoxious about it. Like, some markets, I think, just like are trying to sell you something based on how loud they can be, certain hosts. But I really enjoy getting to find my voice on local radio here, because people listen and people make that a big part of their day in choosing that over other mediums of where they're going to consume their Bears news. Because there's a ton of Bears podcasts out there. There's obviously multiple radio stations in the city. People talk about this team right now all the time, whether it's on TV, whether it's in radio, podcast, on social media, like anywhere, print, whatever it is. But the following that I kind of inherited, just being part of the ESPN 1000 brand and the platform, has given me a chance to really flex my radio muscle. Because there's a big difference, as you know, between doing national radio, which is what I do for ESPN radio, and then ESPN 1000 being a hyper local, but like hyper local in the national scope. Right. Whereas this is the conversation on the Bears starts here and goes nationally. And it's neat to kind of teeter the line of what topics matter to what audiences, because it changes.
Yeah. Around the Horn, I know a lot of people are interested in this. This is a show that my generation, started watching right when we were coming out of college. Your generation grew up watching. It's still relevant, obviously. So how does that work on a week by week basis? You're on twice a week. You've kind of slid right in, and you're just a regular on it now. So what's the experience like being on Around the Horn and working with the different people and working with Tony Reale?
It has been the greatest honor I've had as a professional, getting to be part of that show. Just how well-oiled a machine it is for that happy hour time slot, which is for 5 to 5:30 is Around the Horn, and then 5:30 to 6 going into Sports Center is PTI. That same time slot has been in existence since 2001, 2002, with Around the Horn coming in 2002. That doesn't happen if it's not a good product, if it's not a sustainable product, if it's not a product that can evolve with time. And seeing how it's evolved is been something I've been really proud to be a part of, because when they gave me the call to ask if I'd be interested in coming on as a panelist, I didn't know it was going to become a regular thing. And I had obviously hoped it would, but it's a really unique opportunity for me to get to tap into so many different topics and so many different sports and have opinions about things that I don't get to write about every single day, where yes, my main focus every single day, it's going to be the Chicago Bears. But I was on yesterday and we opened up talking about the Masters and Scotty Scheffler and the dominance that we've seen from him, and Tiger Woods. Do we need to adjust our expectations? Do we even like watching him play anymore when he's clearly struggling out there, even though he made 24 straight cuts? When he's clearly struggling on Saturday and then finishes with his worst score ever, is that something we're still buying into? And then it was the game that was on tonight, Lakers and Pelicans. Should the Lakers strategically try to not be playing the Nuggets in the first round? And then we went on to talk about the Mark Pope hire at Kentucky and the Eastern Conference and how that's shaking out with the play-in tournament coming up. All of these things have nothing to do with my day-to-day, but it allows me, on radio, which radio is what really gave me my start in being a proficient panelist on Around the Horn. You got to know a little bit about everything, and you don't have to be the end-all, be-all expert on any specific topic necessarily, but I've got to watch the games. I've got to have a passion for it. I've got to be able to sell what I think about something, so people either hate it or they love it, or somewhere they fall in between, which typically in this society doesn't happen. There's usually a one or the other, black or white. But it's a lengthy process, but it's a very rewarding process because of how I feel after I get off every show, where there's 6 or 7 different things I got to hit on that I wouldn't be able to if I wasn't on Around the Horn.
This reminds me of conversations we would have when you were in college, though, where it would be 7 or 8 different topics that were only moderately related or sometimes not related at all, other than being sports. But I think, you have to some degree be able to start from that basis. If you're already thinking about those things, and if you grow up consuming media in sports and you're really interested in all of the sports, I don't think it's hard for people to realize how unusual that tends to be. Normally people drill down on the things that they're specifically interested in, as opposed to having opinions on all of it.
No. And when we were talking earlier about podcast, why do people go the podcast route now? Because they want to hear specialized content that is specific to what they want to consume. Same thing with sports. I grew up in an era where, in a market like this too, I think I was very blessed to be able to have a place that had 4 major sports with 5 teams: White Sox, Cubs, Bulls, Blackhawks, and Bears. I didn't just, I don't know if it would have been the same had I grown up in a place like Bloomington and just had college basketball. Or, I think about more relevant example of it now is watching that crowd, that BBN crowd for Mark Pope's press conference, if you want to call it that. That's all they have. Like that.
It's either a coronation or it's some kind of religious ceremony. But yes, go on.
But like, you know what I mean? Like I don't know if I would have been as worldly in my sports ability to consume had I not grown up in a place like this. I don't know if I would have had the wherewithal to know to look outside of what was right in front of me. I just had a lot of options when I was here, from like college sports all the way to the pro sports, and obviously it's a pro sports market. But it's been really unique for me getting to go to different places. Like in Jackson, Mississippi, high school sports are king. SEC football and SEC baseball are obviously a big deal, but that was something I didn't grow up with. I didn't understand the importance of high school sports until I got down there. But I also think that like the reason I can be proficient on a thing like on a platform like Around the Horn is because I've covered a lot of different things throughout my career. I didn't just specialize in, I mean, obviously now my world, my day-to-day is so heavily rooted in football in the NFL, but I covered college sports when I was in college. And I went to a place, like another thing about Indiana, like I got to cover like real college sports, no disrespect to anything like a D3 school or D2 or NAI, whatever. Like I covered a team that people talked about through a really tenuous rebuild. And I covered, going down to Mississippi, I covered 2 SEC schools. Might not have been like the premium SEC schools, even though they both were like 1 and 3 for a stretch in 2014. But, I covered programs that people cared about. And then obviously going out to the West Coast, everybody cared about the Warriors for that stretch and obviously still do. And it's neat to get to say that I covered a lot of different things. And even with baseball, like I covered the year the Giants were last in the NLDS before the recent stretch, like I got a chance to cover that. And it's a way that like makes you, I think, a more well-rounded, for obvious reasons, because you're doing so much, like a more well-rounded sportscaster and ability to tell stories, even if it might not be your, premier sport that you're like the most about.
Yeah, it's interesting on a number of levels, because really it does come down to you're going to go through a natural expansion after a while of what you're focusing on and what your interest levels are. And I mean, I'll say as someone who grew up not in Bloomington, but like a Bloomington equivalent, I grew up in West Lafayette of all places. I think the people that are really interested in sports, you start to branch out relatively early. And even if you don't necessarily have a local rooting interest, there'll be something about the sport that's compelling. I was trying to explain my NFL fandom. It's like I was a Broncos fan for about the first 15 years that I consciously watched the NFL. I also rooted for the Colts, but the games were always blacked out because they moved to Indy in '84 and really weren't a team that people paid attention to until the mid '90s. So, but the Broncos had John Elway and they were always on in the 4:00 hour. And it's like, that I found that team compelling in a number of ways. Sure. And then that opens up everything else. And it's, sports media coverage is fascinating because when you're reporting on teams or when you're commentating or when you're on a show like Around the Horn, it's easy, I think, for people to assume that you're either talking down to them or you don't know what you're talking about. When in reality, it's like, no, I've learned so much of these things, and it's like, how do I take that knowledge and apply it in a way that sounds relevant? Like the fact that national commentators are able to talk relevantly about sports all across the country, I've always found like a really unique talent. That's hard to do. And there's not a whole lot of places where you have to do it that way. Otherwise, like a Miami Dolphins fan, if you don't really understand the roster or what's going on with them, you're going to come across very quickly as someone who does not know what they're talking about.
And it's not to say like, there's a lot of prep work that goes into that, trying to think like what's a good example of this. Like hockey is not something that, the Blackhawks are in this rebuild period right now. So like my fandom of trying to latch on to, I said this when I came back, I was like, you know what? I'm back in my hometown, like market. I'm going to find a team to be a fan of. And like, the Bulls are not even trying. Like they're in the 9 seed, and I get it. Like they're going to be out tomorrow anyways when they lose in the play-in tournament, or if they win a game, then they're going to probably get swept in the first round. Like that's cool. But like, I didn't have that. The Blackhawks, kind of like what you were saying with the Colts, they were blacked out for most of my childhood because that was just the way that they did things here. It was an old way of thinking, but I didn't really become a Blackhawks fan until after college, or when I was in college when they won the first cup in 2010. But like Now it's like, all right, team's rebuilding. So what am I going to latch onto? What am I going to expand my bandwidth to like be a fan of? And I still kind of not hesitant, but I'm still kind of in that spot where it's like, all right, I'm not really sure if I'm like a true fan of any certain team. I mean, like I love going to Cubs games. The team's really good. You know, it's going to be really good this year, but that allows me then to tap in. Like I can parachute in and watch 76ers Heat and have a vested interest in what the outcome's going to be because I know the storylines, because I've invested myself in learning the storylines. And, you know, when like as a national voice or somebody who's like tasked with talking about national topics, like you have to have that. You have to have the ability to stretch.
Yeah.
And it's not something that comes overnight. And even sometimes now and around the horn, there'll be like a topic like on something that I'm trying to think what's a good example of this, like something I may not be like all that up to speed on, but you have to get yourself up to speed on. Like tennis. Yeah. I mean, tennis is a good example because, you know, pretty soon we're going to be coming up on, you know,
sorry, Jeremy Gray. Apologies, but yes.
But I mean, like, you know, I like, will I watch what happens at Roland Garros? Absolutely. Every year I do. And, you know, it's like last year was awesome when Wimbledon was going on, when we were out in New York, because I was doing First Take and Get Up. And we watched I'll never forget, like watching the Sunday 5-hour match between Carlos Alcaraz and Novak Djokovic and watching how that ended. But like, am I watching every single tennis match and like the Miami Open and everything else leading into that? No, I'm not. But when the time comes to be able to talk about the big events, you got to have a knowledge base to go off of. And that's just how I consume things every single day, little bit by little bit by little bit. And then you'd be surprised. I mean, there's a lot of things floating up in here that I don't know where it gets stored. But when you have this recall of like pulling out this random ass fact from like, you know, like I just gave you, like, you know, I could tell you exactly where we were in Financial District the day we watched Carlos Alcaraz fall to the ground, and, you know, just what a cool match that was. Like it was beating the GOAT by many people's estimation in Novak Djokovic. And then, you know, I can't remember what I ate for dinner tonight.
Right.
Like,
I have the same affliction. I wish mine was just limited to sports, but it extends into every area. Well, let's transition a little bit here. We had some questions that people had sent in. So Jay asks, what is this insanity about JJ McCarthy being a top 6 or so pick?
I mean, there's a lot of smoke around it right now, but I get it from the sense of, you know, scouts are very conflicted on him, at least people that I've talked with. And I think that's kind of been the common theme about if he was worth this high of a draft pick, how come we didn't see him throw more in college? How come we didn't see more of the offense built around him? And there's a multiple number of reasons for that happening. But I've heard he can go as high as 2. He can fall as low as 12. And when you have a gap like that, it's kind of like, just be careful if you're one of these people who wants to bet on where guys are going when the discrepancy is that large. And we heard Washington had him, Jaden Daniels, and Drake May in the building this week. He went out to the Patriots recently. Like, I'm always skeptical when I see quarterbacks in the order going 1, 2, 3, 4, which would mean that the Cardinals trade out of 4 and somebody like Minnesota maybe comes up and gets JJ McCarthy. Last year we heard the order was going to be 1, 2, 3, 4. Very rarely does the order pan out the way that we see it. And I think the wild card in all of this is going to be what the Patriots do at 3. Do they trade out of that pick? Do they take a receiver there and just roll with Jacoby Brissett and think that, you know, they can get more of and maybe even trading out of that pick, getting more draft capital to use later? Could they get a quarterback later? Like, whatever. The draft order is never usually what we expect it to be, which is what makes this thing even more wild, with JJ McCarthy being considered by some, at least in the conversation right now, as the number 2 quarterback taken.
The quarterback stuff is always so fascinating because the draft is so divorced in order from the reality.
It always is.
You know,
wild.
The number of times the Patrick Mahomes like pick number gets brought up in relation to like Mitch Trubisky, for instance. Yeah. And there's so many instances of that. It's such a crapshoot. Okay, we had a couple of other questions here. this was mostly from our IU media group. Matt asked if you liked The Bear, not the team, but the TV series, if you had a chance to watch that yet.
So in August of 2022, I started it, but I fell asleep on the couch right behind me.
Terrible sign.
The first episode, there's a lot going on. There's like a lot of ASMR, a lot of like noise and like chopping of things. But I do live right near Mr. Beef. Like that is a fun fact about me. That's over at the corner of Huron, more or less, in Orleans. And I'm not far from there. So I pass it literally every single day. And they were filming in my neighborhood. I don't know, what is it, season 3, I guess? They were filming recently. So I don't know if I'd be like, if you'll see me in the background of some shot driving down the street, but I will give it another go because I've heard really good things about it. It was just in the middle of training camp 2 years ago that I started it and just knocked out in the middle of the second episode. And by the time I woke up, like 2 or 3 episodes played, I was like, God, I can't deal with this. Yeah. And then I haven't turned it back on.
It's hard for me to sink my teeth into any TV series at this point.
I struggle with it.
It's just a time suck. And this actually brings up another question that was brought up, which is a similar question to one that our friend answered when she was on the show. But like, what kind of work-life balance are you able to establish given the amount of things that you do and the number of places that you're expected to be and the amount of time that those things take to do?
It's something that I struggle with. And I mean, Trisha did her podcast from the kitchen. So I did mine from the kitchen to, in solid area. Sorry, I have like awful lighting in here, but it's one of many things that Trisha and I, work-life balance and the imbalance, one of the many things that she and I have in common. And it's like you go through different seasons during the year where the work is at its heaviest and when you're able to push back a little bit. And right now I got my calendar right here and I have been like this, my April right now, which is kind of just like a chicken scratch everywhere. But I've been having the panic attack moments when I'm like, oh my God, training camp starts on July 20th. That is so much closer than we think it's going to be by the time you get through the draft, you get through rookie mini camp, you get through mandatory mini camp. And then the NFL takes a break more or less from like middle of June till for the Bears, early July. That doesn't mean I have a break. I mean, my last couple years have been Bears ending straight out to New York right after the NBA finals for First Take, for Get Up. And I've been filling in summer as a huge radio opportunity for me because I'll do sometimes 4 to 5 shows a week, including my own. And Around the Horn doesn't go on break until the middle of August, which is kind of nice. It balances well with training camp. But it's difficult when it's a privilege, but it's difficult when you have, like, I don't just have one job at ESPN. And I think that's a good thing for someone like me who wants to be have my hand in a lot of different pots, but allocating time to do all of those things that require you to use different parts of your overall toolbox. It's sometimes it can be overwhelming to where you're like physically and mentally tapped out after certain days. Like, the days that I have to do Around the Horn and write and or add radio or a podcast in there, that's 3 different mediums all in one. And, they all require an immense amount of preparation. Like, can I riff? Can I wing it on radio? So, yeah, sure. But is it going to sound good? No. Like, you have to prep. Like, even for the podcast that I do, and my co-host and I have been doing it now for more than a year. We know each other's body language. We know how to, have a conversation. We still do prep for all of those things. And it's difficult when you try to fit all of those things into one day. And then by the time the day is over, you look up and you're like, what did I do today? And then you can like, holy crap, I did so much. And the prep element, like for Around the Horn, I remember showing my students my calendar, the first boot camp I taught at Indiana last April in 2023. I kind of did this exercise for myself as much as I did it for them to show when I work for one entity, and technically it's 2 because Good Karma Brands owns ESPN 1000, but I work for big ESPN and then under that umbrella, ESPN 1000. Like, to allocate my time between more or less 4 or 5 roles within all of that and what it looks like on a daily basis. Like, there are a lot of different colors on the calendar because it's all different things that are eating up time. And the prep element, is a huge part of it. Like for Around the Horn, my day more or less starts with like prepping around 7:30 in the morning. I get out of the chair around 2:15, 2:30 by the time we're done filming. And that's not straight through. Like you're not like in front of a computer for like 9 hours or however long that is, but it's the prep time for me. And that's consuming, that's reading the stat packet that they give us. That's, going my places that I typically go to consume information on whatever it is. That's having the conference call. That's, calling my producer if I want to sort through something else. That's going and doing hair and makeup. That's getting in the chair. That's the actual filming process. And then you're done. It's like, whoa, that was more than half a day. Sometimes that might be all somebody would do in a day, but then I've got to go write something about the Bears, or I've got to start working on a different story, or I've got to make a call for an interview. Like, it's very hard when you're trying to do it at a high level to have much of a work-life balance. And the rare times I do have time that's like more downtime, I feel like I can't even say like time off, because there's always something that's going to fill the void. It's difficult for me to know how to act. Like even today, I got some edits back on a story my editor sent me. I had made all these calls and sent out emails for another story I'm working on. I'm like, I've got like 2 or 3 hours here that I could just go for a walk, or like, go to the grocery store, or even like just clean my house. Like, it's hard when you're in the grind, and the grind becomes so second nature to know what happens when you have a moment of respite. And I don't do well with that. And maybe it's because I've kind of got the high achiever thing going, where I want to achieve, I want to win, I want to do things at a very high level, but it can be very difficult to turn that off.
Yeah. I wouldn't know anything about that. But it's
like you made all of us like this.
My fault. I'm sorry. I should have been a better parent. No, but it's tough. And it is the big, and look, it's funny in sports related jobs. Everything you just said, it sounds a lot like how coaching operates.
Yeah.
Where it's like the talented people end up getting asked to do more and more. And you don't really feel like you have a choice, especially if you're in your late 20s, early 30s. That's like when you're blossoming, you're going to get taxed in like 9 different directions. And it's easy for people who don't or aren't they're not in the business, or they think you just pop up on television and you just talk and that's it. Mm-hmm. It's hard for people who don't really grasp how much time all of that takes to really get your head wrapped around it. And it's a tough balance. I that's probably the one thing I've done a terrible job of teaching, is like, what are you supposed to do to get that balance in place? And
I don't know.
Honestly, I think it's different for everybody. It's kind of like it's like we were talking about earlier with who gets excited about multiple sports. I think you're either born going into overdrive whenever these things happen, or you're not. And there's not really a good in between.
No, you're right. And it's like, you have to love the grind, which sounds so cliche, but it is like coaching in that sense, where the hours are chaotic and they're not normal. And you can't really get into a morning routine a lot of days, where, I've gotten into routines where I know where I'm at my best. Like, I'm not a nighttime writer. So for me, if I've got to write something, if I've got to transcribe, I can't be the person like, oh, let me just like mindlessly do this while I've got like Netflix on. I'm a 4 a.m. wake up when the world is sleeping and grind it out for a couple of hours and get my writing done that's when I'm most focused and where I have a clear head, where I wish I could be a night owl, because then I could actually like sleep like a normal person, hopefully after the time you're done working. But you have to be able to adjust to it too. And it's hard. Like what, Trisha, for example, like, I don't know how people always ask me about the NFL, like, oh, like, must be nice. Like, season goes September to January. What do you do the rest of the year? And like, not realizing or being too ignorant to understand that this is a year-round league. Right. But my travel for the NFL, like, I've got 8 or 9 road games. Like, what Trisha does and what other people do who have the NBA or Major League Baseball, when you're on like 3-game road trips and then you've got like another city you're flying to, then you're back for it. Like, that is, I don't know if I'd survive doing that. That is a grind. Every grind is difficult, but that's one that like is just so difficult. I couldn't do all that I'm doing and have a travel schedule like that. I couldn't do all these different mediums if I was covering baseball.
For those who didn't listen to the podcast with Trisha's the sideline reporter for the Tampa Bay Rays and also does sideline reporting for Apple TV Plus. And I was just talking with her about this the other day, where it's like you're on a 6-game road trip. For those who don't know, I did play-by-play for about 5 years in minor league sports, which was like a different and both better and worse version of that, where you're on buses instead of planes, but you're gone for a week and a half, and then you come back and you're not really home. You're just waiting until you leave again.
Yeah.
And then and it's funny, we're talking about this. We're doing this podcast on the 16th of April, and I'm looking at the MLB scoreboard, and the Rays are hosting the Angels right now, and then the bottom of the 13th inning. So it's like even if you've got a game, like a night planned out, it's like I'm going to go do something after the game. Then you get 5 extra innings of baseball just randomly thrown at you. It is a hard balance, and it's certainly something that's you don't really grasp it unless you're in it.
And you only get better at, like, I've learned little tips and tricks of working ahead to stay on schedule. So I have like a physical written out planner so I can keep have benchmarks for myself, because when you have a schedule that's all over the place and a lot of things that are, eating away at your time and a lot of demands on your time, it can be really hard to actually get the work done when there is the travel element and there is the meeting element and there is the prep element. That helps. What I've been doing now has been kind of help keeping me accountable on all of that, because it can just be so overwhelming. And you look up and you're like, wait, I had all these extra things I had to do today and I wasn't able to get them done because work got away from me.
And of course, what did I do to Courtney right before she's getting ready to do all these draft things? We kept her on a podcast for 65 minutes as opposed to letting her go.
No, but this is my way of kind of like unwinding. As weird as that probably sounds to somebody, where it's like, well, it's not work to me, but it's like we're still talking about work. But this is my way of unwinding. And I think you just have to find that, whatever it is, whether, because a lot of people ask me, oh, are you, cover sports, you must be a huge sports fan. And in a way I am, but I don't have I have to sit down and watch every single Cubs game every single night, the way that I would if I wasn't working and entrenched in this all the time, because sometimes you just need like a mental break from it. Like, I love football and, I'm constantly consuming whatever games are on, but there's not, for me, you just have to find something sometimes that just like lets you put it down for a couple minutes. And if that's me being able to go to bed an hour earlier, then that's what I'll do, versus let me stay up and, watch, whatever is going to happen in this Warriors-Kings game. If the game's not over and I'm tired, I'm going to bed, then I'm going to bed and I'm going to catch up on it in the morning.
This is where the DVR era has really helped.
Oh God, it's huge.
Or whatever they're calling it now. If it's not DVR.
I still have Xfinity. I think I'm the only one in America who has not cut the cord. And you're
keeping the RSNs alive by yourself right now. So
I really am.
As I always tell students, and we'll wrap up after this, but it's, if you're going to go in this business, I didn't invent this. This actually, I think, came from Keith Olbermann in that book that he did with Dan Patrick, The Big Show, where, it's like, do you like ice cream? Yeah, everybody likes ice cream. What if you had to eat ice cream for your job 3 times a day, every day? And not just the flavors that you enjoyed, but like the weird flavors that you wouldn't normally touch. That's essentially, if you can still love it, but you have to take breaks from it for a while, just to kind of refresh the palate and give your mind a break and get it onto something other than that, because after a while you reach a point of saturation. And I think it's a good lesson for anybody going into anything that involves like really deep study of, sports, you would think it'd be a casual thing, but sports is so complicated and it's such this weird combination of personal stories and storylines and personality profiles and statistics and analysis and all of this noise. And it seems to get added to every year. There comes a point where you cannot digest anymore. Like you're just going to hit a point where your brain's like, sorry, that didn't make it in.
Some of the hardest times for me in doing that, oddly enough, is during the NBA playoffs, because a lot of times I'm doing radio, or at least last couple of years, like I was filling in a bunch, the 2 to 6 stretch, and I'd have Around the Horn, the next day. So I've got to stay up and watch multiple NBA games. And sometimes it's like, God, I just got done talking. Like one thing I've had an issue with, like an issue is probably like a strong word, but one thing I have like coming down, and like my family's kind of like gotten to like know, like, you know, when to expect me to be present, when to not expect me to be present. Because when I've been talking for 4 hours, and I know it's 4 hours out of your day, but like you have to be on that entire time, because otherwise you're not going to be entertaining. You're not going to say anything worth a damn. And it's just bad radio. You can't be like somewhere else. You have to be fully physically and mentally present. It's not easy for me to shut that off. And by the time I may turn that off at the end of my shift or whatever it is, I'm exhausted. And then I'm not just sitting down casually watching Jimmy Butler rip apart teams last year. Like it made it easy because he was so entertaining and that Heat team was so electric as they just ripped through the Eastern Conference. But I'm consuming that in a way where I'm consuming for knowledge of what I'm going to use for my arguments the next day. I'm not just, let me casually watch this. I'll be on my phone. Like, that's when it's your job, you consume it differently. Right. And you're taking notes and you're trying to remember certain things. Oh man, like look at this run they went on. I'm going to reference this because I know it's going to come up in this thing tomorrow. Like when what you used to do or what some people do for enjoyment is part of your job, like you've got to massage that delicately so you can get what you need to out of it. Because sometimes that's where I get burned out the most. And
that's the challenge, I think, is with people working in any form of media, but especially sports media. Can you not become cynical about it? Can you retain the optimism and the enjoyment that the audience wants to hear? And if you try to come across if you try to manufacture the enthusiasm, people notice that immediately.
Sure.
So you have to find a way to make it genuine, and that can be a genuinely difficult thing to do. So, well, Courtney, this was awesome. This was kind of a therapy session as much.
I know, that's why I like doing them, because it does feel like a therapy session. And anytime I do a friend's podcast and we end up like talking about like the business element around sports and what you do, it's like, we all have common threads in it and we all deal with the same struggles. And that's, it is therapy to get to like talk through those things, but it's also really cool to like see how far you've come. Cause like when you're in the thick of it every day, you don't realize like, oh wow, I've got all these really cool things. Like they didn't just come out of thin air. You earn them. And it's neat to kind of stop for a second and realize, wow, I am doing some really cool things I'm very proud of.
Yeah. And you should be. You've had an amazing career so far. And, it's nothing but a source of pride watching you do what you do on a daily basis. So
thank you.
So we'll, on that note, go ahead and wrap up. We really appreciate Courtney joining us here on the show, and I appreciate all you folks listening as well. You can catch Courtney on NFL draft coverage coming up and pretty much everywhere else in the ESPN constellation, especially if you're living in Chicago. So tune in for that. Thanks to all you folks. We'll be back. A lot of Little 5 content this week as the Little 500 is happening Friday and Saturday. So stay tuned for that. For Courtney, I'm Galen. This is Crimson Cast. We'll catch you folks on the flip side. Bring back the Bison. So long, everybody.